to text, and the code for that is across the slides on the bottom, and then please fill out an evaluation in order to receive that credit. Today for our time lecture, we welcome Dr. Bennett Goldberg. Dr. Goldberg is currently the Director of Research in Higher Education, Training, and Evaluation at Northwestern. He is a professor of physics and astronomy and the Assistant Provost of Learning and Teaching. Prior to that, he was the Director of the Searle Center for Advanced Learning and Teaching from 2016 until very recently. Under Dr. Goldberg's leadership, the Searle Center became a research practice partnership that collaborated across Northwestern, including with Feinberg, and with the national and international academic community to catalyze and sustain change that supports learning at all levels for all learners. He also leads an SF project to develop and deliver inclusive pedagogy for STEM instructors nationwide, improving access to and success in STEM for marginalized and minoritized students. The title of today's lecture is Lessons from Teaching During COVID. Thank you, Dr. Goldberg.
Well, thank you everybody for joining me today. And I see lots of friends here. You can add questions to the chat, and if I get a chance to address them during the talk, I will. Please also note that as we go on today, there'll be a couple of opportunities for you to share your experiences. This is a community of experience in teaching during COVID, and sharing amongst all of us is part of what we're here to do today. So I will put links to a couple of whiteboards called Padlets, and please share your thoughts when that part comes up. And I'm going to start sharing my screen now. So today I'll be talking about lessons during COVID and the experience of many of you who have shared some of your stories with me. And really the central theme that I'd really like to address today is the fact that there's good evidence that we have experienced as instructor almost 10 years of cultural change in 1 year. And so the question really is for higher education generally, how do we sustain that cultural change, and what are the mechanisms that we might employ to do so? So I'll start by saying, what are our challenges to teaching reform generally? We've known about things like active learning that create more inclusive environments for many, many years. And we've known about things around active and collaborative in learning, and where these instructional activities that we put into place involve students thinking about what they're doing and learning from that thinking and sharing it with others. But we've also been studying the challenges, especially in STEM education, but in education more broadly. And the challenge to teaching reform doesn't really lie in knowing what works, but more in getting people to use proven techniques. And there are many barriers to that. There's barriers having to do with our reward systems, and there are barriers in our own disciplinary traditions, and certainly within our institutional structures. So I'll be addressing some of those barriers today in talking about what do we do with this massive change that impacted probably more than 1 million instructors in higher education in the past 1 year. So how does cultural change in learning and teaching happen? Cultural change in learning and teaching happens through gaining new perspectives. It happens through people undergoing expert training and in sharing what they're doing with each other. And it turns out that being in a community that supports that change and supports that learning is a central piece of this. And communities of practice that have sprung up across Northwestern and everywhere are central to how that cultural change can happen. And in those communities and in what we're trying to do today is really trying to create a sense of that shared experience and shared knowledge that we've all experienced as we've gone on. And if we can sustain these kinds of things, then we can really leap forward 10 years of cultural change in only 1 year. So how do we think about this 10 years of cultural change? And part of this has to do with conversations with a very good friend of mine, Derek Bruff, who's from Vanderbilt, who runs the Center of Learning and Teaching there. So at the onset of the COVID pandemic, approximately 80% of faculty in research-intensive universities like ours had never taught online. The data from the Northwestern teaching survey that I was heavily involved in doing in the spring identified that outside of the School of Professional Studies, it was between 75 and 82% who had never taught online. Many faculty haven't used our learning management systems technology beyond posting assignments and other things. They hadn't engaged on the learning management systems in terms of asynchronous learning. And then approximately, and this is very approximately 50 faculty per year tended to participate in training and high engagement trainings that lasted periods of time. And then finally, faculty reflected, but not all that frequently, about their teaching pedagogy or thought deeply about how their students are learning. So what has changed? What is new? Approximately 95% of us, if not more, have already taught online and have experienced that. Many of us have used educational technologies in numerous ways, whether it's creating asynchronous content, creating groups that people engage in, building things that people use outside of the synchronous kind of environments in classrooms. And approximately 10 times the number of faculty have engaged in deep, high engagement trainings with experts across the country. And my experience has been that many faculty have now deeply reflected on their teaching and thought about how their students are learning. And so these are significant elements that have drastically shifted the framework and the landscape of what instructional practice has been. I'll give you one example that's of this 500 faculty, 10 times the number of people engaged in training. So at Northwestern, the library and NUIT and the Searle Center got together and in the spring developed a teaching practicum. By now, more than 700 faculty across all schools have engaged in that teaching practicum. The data from even this summer indicated that there's been more than 1,500 participants in Searle Center and NUIT workshops. Another example is Vanderbilt, where typically they would have about 50 faculty a year engaging in their curriculum bootcamp, and this year they had 500. At Brandeis University, the provost offered $500 for each faculty that took a one-week course on course development and inclusive teaching, and they had 98% compliance. And in my conversations with directors of centers of learning and teaching across the Big Ten, similar reports about how this massive engagement in professional development has happened. And it's happened because it was necessary. It was happened because so few of us had experiences on online teaching and learning, and many of our institutions, nearly all of them, really stepped up and provided that training across multiple frameworks. So I'm going to actually start right here with a question for you. I'd like you to go to this Padlet, which I will put in the chat in one heartbeat of a second. So here is the link, and that link is now in your chat. If you click on that, you will come to a Padlet that looks like what I'm showing in front of you now. And I'm going to take 2 minutes for you to name one important new realization that you've had about teaching during the COVID-19 pandemic. If you click on the little right thing at the bottom, and I can see many of you are into this already, it will bring up a small box that you can share. Hey Siri, set timer for 90 seconds.
Okay, 1 minute and 30 seconds and counting.
Well, thank you. This is, it's wonderful and amazing. You've obviously all learned quite a lot. There's a lot in here about the challenge of engagement, which is great because we'll talk a lot about that today and a lot about what some people have done to create engagement, even though it's extremely difficult in the spaces that we're not used to doing engagement. And I hope I'm demonstrating here a very simple way to create some engagement with your community. I'm going to stop here for 1 second and ask, would anyone like to just raise their hand and go on video and talk a little bit about what they might have written here? Feel free to just jump in.
I'll go. Sorry, I don't have my video on. There we go. Whoops. Laptop's closed. Anyway, yeah, my comment was that students love interacting, and particularly they crave it when the opportunities are limited.
Mm-hmm. Right. They do love interactions. And we're also so used to interacting in person, right? We're so used to the kind of the in-person interaction that it's been very difficult to do this switch to the online environment. But some people see some things. Someone said they really love the hybrid. Would that person like to talk about what they love about the hybrid model? Julie, did you have something to say? You went off mute.
Yeah, I did, about my comment that I use a lot of games in my teaching, or at least I used to use a lot of games in my teaching, but I'm finding it hard to think about how to recreate those as things that I can do in Zoom. So I really miss the in-person sessions that we had. I've managed to do, some things I've changed, but it just didn't have the same energy that I was able to create in person.
Well, that's great. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you all for adding your comments into there. And I will share those. They're all anonymous, which is by intention. I'm going to use a framework, a very sort of a standard, simple framework for understanding teaching. And learning is at the center of this framework. And part of the framework brings in us, the faculty, the instructors. What are our biases? What do we know and don't know? What are our assumptions? The student as well brings a lot of their own assumptions about how they learn and how they expect the class to happen into that space. There's the content that we want to deliver and the understandings that we want to create, the learning objectives of our course. And usually we say, well, the space matters. What's the classroom like? What's the environment and things like that? What we had to do in teaching during COVID is we had to basically replace space with technology, right? And so we had to become facile in some way with the technologies around learning and teaching, in these remote environments to bring all of these things together. So faculty bring their attitudes towards instruction and teaching, their expert knowledge. Students bring their attitudes and their preconceptions and their motivations. The content is the knowledge framework and the rationale and context. And then the technology, that's a real modifier, right? As many of you have said in your Padlet, it's a challenge to negotiate that, to create student to student and instructors to student engagement, what we often call social presence. And so we're really going to focus a little bit on what Northwestern and other faculty have done to enable that social presence as a way of learning how to teach during COVID, and then the lessons that we have from doing so to teaching beyond. And so learning happens within that construct and within that space. So I'm going to do a whole set of examples here, and some of them are from Northwestern and some of them or from some other colleagues and friends of mine, and a shout out to, again, Derek Bruff. In many cases, some students have been in the classroom, physical distance and wearing masks, and some students have participated remotely via video conference. This hybrid model has been used across the country, and it's had some challenges to it. So how do we have a class-wide discussion? How do we engage our students in that kind of environment in a hybrid mode? And how do we maintain equity? We have two different audiences, two different structures. And so there's a number of ways in which I'll talk about how faculty have engaged and maintained equity while they have these kinds of classroom-wide discussions through the technology of these conferencing platforms like Zoom. One classic approach is to use back channel and chat. And so chat can take many formats. It can be note-taking, you can do commenting, you can amplify things, you can ask and answer questions, you can offer suggestions, you can build community, you open up the classroom to a wider audience, and in many cases, you can support equity and access. So I'll give you some examples of how we use a back channel effectively during our synchronous sessions, for example. And so here's a back channel that Derek had done during one of his trainings over at Vanderbilt. So he has back and forth that happens. We use a lot of live polling. Here's some examples from some work that I've done during a postdoc retreat where I live poll the audience, much like I live polled you as an audience with the Padlet, to get you to think about what we're doing while we're doing it, and so you can engage more directly. And in many ways, see what everyone else is thinking. So it's not simply me standing here and talking, but it's you interacting with each other. And so often a lot of these kinds of live polling and back channels are effective in creating that. You can also use this to highlight various things. What I didn't tell you in the first Padlet is you saw thumbs up and thumbs down. You could upvote things. And so I could get, as an instructor, a sense of prioritization among all of the community and do that during the presentation, during the conversations and discussions that we have. So live polling is just one example of that. Another example is group work. We've always done group work in our classrooms, often in breakouts and often in various ways. And so, here's a simple way of a spreadsheet that we use to engage a community. In this case, this was Northwestern faculty who were talking about their hesitancies to program evaluation. And so different breakouts each had a little space and they could talk about what they were doing. We've often done things with Google Docs, and Google Docs are very effective at bringing groups together where they start to define different terms and they work with each other and co-create knowledge that is then shared out. And so that's another effective ways of doing it. Here's another technique that I've used in what active learning strategies would you like to try in an asynchronous online settings? And so getting groups to dig into that and to reflect on it together and to create this sense of joint knowledge so that even during a kind of a Zoom session, breaking it up with these kinds of things has been a very effective technique that many people have done. I want to talk about a couple of different examples from Northwestern faculty. This is an example from Marco Gallio, who's teaching a genetics for neuroscience course to over 500 students. And his instructional approach has been to do sort of a partially blended things. He's recorded short lectures. Students have then watched these lectures. He's then had students basically expressed to him what they wanted to be explained or worked on in detail prior to his class. And so that he was able to then take that in a virtual session with a mixture of lecture and discussion based, where he's really reflecting and highlighting what the students are asking about, what more information they would like, what concepts they have struggled with. And so he's able to then create a group community engagement in his virtual sessions that would follow some of this asynchronous engagement with some of his pre-recorded lectures that he's done. And the outcomes he's seen have been several. The outcomes have been that students really felt more connected to the instructor and to the material than in his traditional, more didactic lecture style that he had done previously. And also this greater opportunity created more agency among the students. They felt more engaged. It was their learning that was centered in this kind of flipped class with just-in-time teaching. And his surveys of students realized that the students actually really enjoyed this quite a lot. They enjoyed this kind of approach to his teaching. Another example from many that you know here at Feinberg, this is a picture of David Saltzman, and he has, together with many other folks, Pat Garcia and Christy Wolnak and many others, really revamped with the beautiful room that you have on the Feinberg campus, this idea of synthesis and application modules. And the goal that David and colleagues had was to maintain active learning, basically match the practice, but change the delivery. And they were very successful in doing that. They shifted to these fully online tools. They explored several different tool sets, Google Docs, Box, shared slides, things like that. And they were able to find very good ways of doing this. This is an example of an immersive studio. That helped too, a place where a faculty member could go and see multiple screens and really orchestrate the environment. And so that had been very successful. The outcomes are that he found that they increase accountability. He found that they used an audience response systems regularly, and those kinds of questions kept the audience engaged. He discovered that the action had to be a little faster in the Zoom setting than it had to be in person. And so he reduced his time periods a little bit and found that the 6 minutes was kind of the sweet spot for shifting from, say, breakout groups or group work or audience response questions to lecturing on materials or showing the expert response. This is an example of one of his audience response system questions. And this is an example of what students did in a breakout to respond to a question about various elements of development of children in the first 1 year. And so this synthesis and application module transitioning to a fully online space was able to really create a dynamic environment that students really liked and really gained quite a lot from. The lessons that David has found is that, of course, there's a social element of learning, and it is harder to do in an online environment, but it is possible to maintain those communities. One of the things that's also true, and that is a sort of a theme throughout, is that this giving students greater ownership of their own learning, greater agency, creates more engagement. They feel more empowered to do and to act and to be engaged in the moment. And so thinking about in your own practice how you create greater student ownership of learning might be a key takeaway. Another example is from Kristen Van Genderen, who has worked together with the Lurie Children's KidStar simulation team, and then a variety of other folks who are listed here, and switched to the virtual simulations in pediatric practice. And what she did, of course, as many of us did, it had to be a very fast evolution to a fully online space. She was able to really reach students who were generally shy and intimidated in some of the in-person environments, and she was able to engage them through the breakouts and the structured virtual simulations in a lot of ways. She's found that this has worked extremely well with medical students and then also with clerkships and electives, and found that this provides greater access, in fact, and to a fuller community that she might be able to engage in the future. And one of the key takeaways for her is that it's critical to focus on the teamwork and the communications between folks. The lessons that she has from takeaway, and you can see on the left-hand side here what it looks like in the virtual learning space with facilitators and operators, and then some of the feedback that she got on the pediatric simulation compared to the previous in-person experiences. This is from her, and it's obviously not a full subset, but there certainly are students who do like it better and are able to engage this way. And I think one of the lessons here is that many of these folks are reaching students where they are. Students are very happy to listen to 5-minute or 8-minute lectures on their phone while they're doing other things or engaging in asynchronous ways, and then coming in synchronously to share what they know and share what they're doing together with us as experts and together with their colleagues. She found that it was incredibly valuable, as I think it always is with teaching, is to incorporate feedback and do so regularly. So monitoring what students are doing and thinking and feeling is a critical aspect of the success here. Another aspect of the success is structured roles, making sure that everybody has a particular role when they go into a simulation or into a breakout. And we found that very true in teamwork and in group work, generally in learning and teaching, that providing structured roles and then switching those roles often can interrupt some of the social dynamic that happens across identities in the room as well. So that's a good thing to remember. And she feels that this has a great deal of options for community hospitals and global health, and improves ideas around access and equity. I'm going to talk a little bit about back to the Evanston campus for a moment, and talking a little bit about Michael Peshkin in mechanical engineering. And he developed a number of different things in his instructional approach. And one of them was a lab in the backpack, which was in fact something that he and others at McCormick had developed almost 10 years ago, but rarely used. And in the switch to the online, fully online, they loaded up 65 backpacks and mailed them all over the world. And so students in his electronics course could do electronics on their kitchen table. Now, a challenge of doing electronics on your kitchen table is creating a way that students can share work. And so one of the things that Michael invented was a document camera mirror, which was a hack to create a document camera at home. And so he just also sent people a 35-cent mirror and a little piece of wire, and showed them how the document camera could just be hung right in front of the video feed on the top of their laptop. And so folks can show their work, and students can examine what is going on in the board, and teachers and teaching fellows could then feed back and forth dynamically, during the synchronous sessions to debug the electronic device and to show their own work in multiple ways, whether it's written or whether it's physical. And so these kinds of things have been used quite a lot to create greater engagement. And so here's a TA working with a student on a simple free body diagram, exploring how to write Newton's laws about balancing tension and gravity in these force diagrams. The other thing that Michael did was teach a programming class in Python. And in fact, one of the fascinating things about the programming class is that it actually had greater learning outcomes than the in-person class. That this environment where people were coding all together and working in groups and using a laboratory environment that was online was a very guided, engaged conversation. And students would code bits and they would get it to work. And even though they weren't speaking, this group of 90 students had a very active chat stream, very active in giving each other feedback and helping each other in the programming environment. And so that particular example was one that was very effective. Switching back to Feinberg briefly, one of the interesting things that Luis, who I see is here today, thank you for joining us, is a virtual pathology elective. And in this virtual pathology elective, Luis, together with Christy and Raven and others, basically they were already doing a curriculum redesign, right? They were already shifting more of their didactic lectures to a space of case scenario and asking questions and getting the students to engage directly in the decision-making process. Now, when COVID hit, of course, they had to shift this quickly to a completely and fully online environment. And so what Luis and his colleagues did is they created some foundational videos. They did home examinations of real objects. And so students, again, within a home environment could act as if they are doing a pathology test, looking at the size and structure and things like this of various aspects of home. And then this idea of reaching the students where they are was again effectively done. He created projections of real-time imaging, and he would live stream as he walked through an interoperative consultation, almost like you have somebody on FaceTime on your phone and they're walking along with you as you describe what it is to do that kind of experience. The other commonality of Luis and many others is this idea of learner feedback and revision. Part of the reason that we've all engaged with our students so much more about asking what they are thinking and feeling and learning and what is working is that we suddenly feel disconnected from them. And so many have then really ramped up their feedback and have found that enormously valuable. This is a picture of Luis with his a small video that helped people decide on measurements of things. He had pre-session videos for intraoperative consultation and real-time reviews. And so that allowed in this in virtual pathology elective, the students to really engage in the work itself and get a very strong sense of what it was to do these kinds of interoperative consultations. And then this is an example of walking through the microscopy itself. And so students were engaged, they saw the camera, they were talking through the case, asking questions and doing that kind of work. The lessons was that everybody was involved. He had medical students and residents and content experts and many people involved. It's a real team effort to do something like this, but that team effort really pays off. Luis and his colleagues found out that now that they have some foundational videos and instructional pieces that are relatively short, there's a great deal of portability now, the kind of thing that you could use prior to a surgery rotation or something like that. So students could really get a feel of the different aspects of it. And they believe that they can use it in many, many places going forward. And they thought that there was a lot of high quality asynchronous content, again, that can be used again in the future, not to replace in-person work, but to really enhance it and to create a space where students can do it at various times, spend more time with it, ask questions about it, and then bring that back into your in-person synchronous sessions in the future. So what has happened? There's been a lot of faculty shifts in attitudes and practice, and these are some examples of that. Many of us have experimented with and practiced many new approaches. Many have sought and applied training in various ways. Many have collected and valued student feedback and done that in rapid revisions for a lot of their work. And then many have recognized and differentiated their work in response to student needs and styles. And so these are some shifts in faculty attitudes and practices that have occurred due to this cultural change in teaching that has happened because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So there have been many positive lessons from the COVID era of instruction, and the positive lessons are the things that we really want to carry forward in our own practice and to incorporate as we go forward as instructors in the future. I think also there's been a lot of student shifts in attitudes and practice. I think that we're teaching engaged students how they live. Students are pretty facile with short chunks of video. This is part of what they do all the time, the way they receive information, the way they connect with the world. We've also engaged students how they live in terms of back channel chat, texting and sharing of documents and things like that. It's another place that our students are often much more facile than we are. We've also encouraged in our asynchronous trainings, in our asynchronous learning and teaching, quite a lot of freedom to engage on their own schedules. This freedom gives them more agency and gives them more ownership of their own learning. And the more we give them ownership of their own learning, the more deep learners they become and less strategic or surface learners. The distinction being that deep learning is really getting them to ask and think about the content in deeper ways rather than what do I have to do to pass the next test in some sort of strategic approach to learning. And I think that the students, by and large, have largely embraced these opportunities for ownership and agency. And we've seen that across many examples of not only the ones I've given, but elsewhere as well. Students want to learn in structured ways outside of the traditional classroom. It means that sometimes it requires more frequent thinking. That is, that they now understand that learning is a process of not only seeing something once and reflecting on it once, but actually through multiple engagements. And so one of the real opportunities here is to continue to engage them outside of the classroom in asynchronous moments so that they are reflecting on what they are learning as they are learning it. And it's not universally true that all students have valued this new teaching structure, but I think that many, many students have. To be fair, it's not an entirely rosy picture. And, you know, some faculty, I would say many, still think in a traditional attitudes and practices. I've talked to many faculty who are quite resistant both to changing their perspectives, even for the time of COVID, as well as to, you know, perhaps get training or join a community of practice or something like that. And so that's happened frequently. And in some institutions, of course, there's been restrictions that you have to teach hybrid. And that has been a real challenge to many faculty, not knowing which audience to address and not really feeling comfortable with the choice of having to do so. And so a lot of them have simply resorted to Zoomed lectures. And naturally, a Zoomed lecture is nowhere near as good as an in-person lecture where you can see your audience and you can engage with them and you can see how they're absorbing or not the material, and you can stop and ask questions. And you know, you're in the room, you're seeing their presence, you're really engaging with them. And so when that happens, students are even less engaged. And so, you know, the lesson certainly from this is that it's a requirement, partly within the Zoom environment and within a completely remote learning environment, that we have to change and that we have to create more engaged constructs, but that it's certainly by no means impossible to do so. And I think what we've also seen is that the faculty themselves have sometimes made little effort towards equity across student access. And things around inclusion and equity in teaching have sometimes taken a back seat to simply getting the Zoom lecture online. And that's been something that's that has been sad to see in some teaching environments. And of course, many faculty feel that they've decided that they will never teach online after COVID, but many, many do. So I wanted to be fair in presenting both sides of the story, not just the excellent examples from Feinberg and from Evanston about people who have been enormously successful at Northwestern and beyond, but also that there's a lot of things to overcome and a lot of naturally difficult experiences that some faculty have had during this time. I'm going to stop again here and give you folks a chance to do two things. One is to say a little bit about what teaching practice that you are planning on taking forward. And let me put that link into the chat right now. So that's a link to another Padlet. So what of your teaching practices that you would like to take forward? I'd be very curious as to your own experiences of that and thinking about that as we go forward. Hey Siri, set timer for 90 seconds.
Okay, 1 minute and 30 seconds and counting.
Feel free to upvote other people's comments. Please no downvotes. Well, thank you all. I mean, these are amazing and great comments. I just wanted to highlight a couple here and see if I could get the individual to say a little bit more. There was one, yeah, anytime we need community volunteers or panelists for certain clinical activities, we use Zoom, and it's allowed you to draw in people from all over the world. Who made that comment, and are you willing to go on video and comment further? I will choose another one. How about the use of short videos of historically challenging topics?
Sorry, Bennett, I was muted.
Oh, you're muted.
I was the one who made that comment.
Okay, you got it, Babette. Go ahead.
Yeah, we do a lot of panel discussions in a variety of classes, and we've always done them live. And so we've really had to draw on people in the Chicago area. We had a number of experiences this year that because they were virtual, we were really able to draw on experts from all over the country very easily. And I think it contributed to the depth and breadth of our panelists.
Yeah,
and I think we'll continue to do that in a number of ways.
Yeah, and I mean, I think I totally agree with that, and I've used it as well and seen many others. And I think that that's going to be part of teaching going forward, period. Right? I mean, we will bring in experts from all over the world all the time now, you know, because it's just so easy, and it's something that is now a common occurrence.
Right.
And then the other, thank you, Babette. And the next one I chose about the use of short videos, historically challenging topics. Who is that?
Hi, this is me, Jennifer Ryan.
Hi, Jennifer.
Yeah, in physiology, you know, I used to lecture for 50 minutes at a time, and they would record all of it. And God love them, they would re-listen to those lectures over and over to get the one snippet that they needed. And now not only can I make it less burdensome on them to like think about baroreceptors and just understand them in the moment, but then they can also, we can embed that into our future CVP course to remind them about those physiological components and kind of make it that it dovetails the information for them, not to spoon feed, but to organize the information.
Great. Yeah. I mean, you're making content more easily accessible for a wider range of students in a more efficient way. So awesome. That's great. Thank you. And then the last one here with 3 upvotes, polling inclusion of many more people in class than usual.
Yeah, I just found that including a poll in the lecture is a good way to engage students or to physically ask people questions and call on them, just traditionally like we used to. For people, I know I don't have my camera on right now, but to have people keep their camera on. And then, I'm a radiologist, and we've found that it's just so easy now to get people from all over the world to participate in panels and teaching. It's just been really fantastic.
That's great. Thank you so much for sharing that. I really appreciate it. And thank you all for sharing your ideas here. I will make both Padlets available to all of you afterwards, as well as all of my slides. And so we'll talk about that as we go forward. So thank you for that engagement. So here's the central question for the last 10 minutes of this talk. Will cultural change happen? You all have just told me about the great use of new practices that you're going to carry forward. And to summarize, you're going to be using educational technology in greater ways in your teaching going forward. You'll use asynchronous learning, whether it's video snippets or group work outside of class or all of that. And you're going to integrate these. You'll integrate the asynchronous components with your synchronous in-person components as well. And then I think a new practice that I sometimes see in talking to faculty is you've learned to experiment, discover, and reflect. And I know that sounds trivial, but it isn't. I mean, teaching has not typically been the place where that easily happens. And of course, it was forced on us. We had to, right? We had to discover, we had to experiment. And it was natural for us to do so, given the challenge that we had of rapidly switching the way 1 million instructors in the United States taught. And so these changes will happen. And the real question is, can we sustain this cultural change? Can we sustain a more student-centered teaching practice? And the way cultural change in learning and teaching and in other institutional constructs, the way those things are sustained are some of the following. One is that we build collective knowledge from shared experience. And so that we are now talking to each other and sharing with each other our own learning and our own experiences. And we are all experiencing it anew. So there's a greater sense of shared experience. And that will shift culture, and that can sustain a shift of culture. And one way of doing that is through communities of practice. And I'll talk a little bit about communities of practice. And then further, addressing structure and culture, which is, how do we reward this? How do we reward faculty effort and excellence in learning and teaching? And I hope that our institutions do so, recognizing what people have done not only during COVID, but the cultural change that they want enduring. And then the last point that is a sustaining element is to continue to invest in local and central support. It's been fascinating to see how people have learned. And I'll describe that a little bit. So one of the interesting things that we did when we did the provost transition to teaching spring survey that went out to 2,000 instructors across Northwestern and had nearly a 56% response rate. We actually did a little bit of a social network analysis, an ego network for those in the know, which actually simply asked, from whom did you get advice on learning and teaching? And it turned out that we identified 25 key Northwestern influencers. People like Michael Peshkin or Leah Neubauer or others who brought their community together, helped them in the moment of transition. But what's been fascinating is to see that those communities, many of them have sustained and have come and are now regular communities of practice that might happen. Even though they develop spontaneously within many departments and within many teaching places, these influencers are central to that community of practice network. And many of these have now transitioned as things have remained in COVID, but even looking beyond that. In my own department in physics and astronomy, Shane Larson, who developed a sort of a meeting place for faculty to come and just share experiences and talk about technology and talk about their teaching, he and a particular graduate student by the name of Jacob were able to transition this to a formal teaching seminar. And so in our department now, we have a formal teaching seminar with outside experts, again by Zoom, who come in, and many of the faculty are starting to come to that. So it's a community interaction, a community of practice that is sort of grown anew out of the COVID teaching experience. I wanted to highlight a community of practice in both Program in Public Health and the Center for Global Health Education, led by Leah Neubauer and others. And in their work, of course, it was originally developed just to support educators in the transition to teaching, as these communities grew up in the springtime all over the country. She's evolved this support to support the educators in now thinking more deeply about their practice and continuing to enrich their pedagogy. And each of these communities of practice meets virtually on a monthly or bi-weekly basis. And here's just an example of some of the questions that can help this community of practice engage. How would you describe your teaching approach through a metaphor? What has been a big success, biggest challenge? How have you addressed it? And so when you do this kind of work, in the lower left here, it's just a picture of what community of practice bring together. It's the domain of what we care about, in this case, teaching. It's the practice of how we do it, and it's the community of us that care about it. And that's one of the ways of sustaining cultural change. And what they have discovered is that there's significant greater visibility and awareness. There's technical and community sharing. And then there's this idea of shared knowledges, experiences, and learning from failures. So the more we can support these active communities of practice, the greater opportunities we'll have to sustain, 10 years of cultural change in the post-COVID era. So a vision of the future. Teaching is a dynamic space for growth for both students and instructors. And so embracing that idea of dynamic growth has been something that many of us have done during the teaching during COVID era, as well as the students. And if we hold that central, that it's a dynamic growth for both of us, I think we'll be well positioned to incorporate what we've learned, continue to experiment and reflect, continue to get student input. There's many ideas out there in the learning and teaching space that believe that learning and teaching in higher education will never be the same. Is that it will be a virtual learning fully integrated into in-person learning. And whether it's the panels or the polls or the breakouts or the reaching a greater audience or those kinds of things, whether it's asynchronous content in video snippets and instructional things and in group work that's outside of class, those kinds of virtual learning will forever be fully integrated. And so I'll leave with this question, which is this a watershed moment for higher education? And what can you do about it? And what can we do about it? So I will stop sharing and entertain any questions and comments that people have at this time. And I wanted to thank you for your attention today and for sharing what many of you have provided. A shout out to all those people on all those slides who were freely shared their expertise and their experiences with me. And thank you so much for doing that. Shane, you have your hand raised.
Yeah, thanks, Bennett. That was great. I kind of have two questions that might be related, but let me just ask one of them to start with. Do you have a sense of whether or not in the post-pandemic world, students will demand that we have this kind of classroom opportunities as opposed to just going back to business as normal?
So I will just give you my purely personal and anecdotal response to that because I have no data. I suspect that they will. I mean, I suspect that students in many places have already voted and already are largely not showing up for in-person hybrid when it's not engaging, and are perfectly happy to, to take that class remotely in ways that already fit them better. And I would be shocked if the students, suddenly return to a completely in-person and completely structured synchronous environment like we had before. That isn't to say there isn't great value in that. There is, but I would be surprised. We should never build another 500 auditorium lecture hall, right? We should be using our spaces for those deeply engaging, impersonal, small group break, those kinds of real, learning environments, and students, I think, will vote with their feet and vote with their wallets.
Yeah. So the second part of that then, I guess, was really inspired by your example of the Python class and the example of the pediatric demonstration classes. Are there classes that we really should only teach online in this mode as opposed to face-to-face, so that we exist in the hybrid model because some are better that way and some are better face-to-face?
That's a great question. I think one of the things that many folks have learned going into this is that, in fact, online learning can be very successful, right? I mean, it wasn't, 8 or 9 years ago that there was some experiments with online courses here at Northwestern in the early days of that were, very challenged by faculty without actually knowing that the online learning can be super valuable. I think that there will absolutely be a large number of environments and courses that would be fully online. And I could imagine that we create curriculum that utilizes that because of it gaining in flexibility and gaining in access for students. And I think that there will be some of that for sure.
Great, thanks.
Sarah,
Yeah,
please.
I wanted to comment that I'm daunted by technology. I think that's a voice that needs to be, or a statement that needs to be made. And I'm concerned that there may be a culture or a generational divide among people like me who are really challenged by trying new technologies, and a younger generation. And I hope that we won't be lost in the dust. I think as a response to that, I think that I would need assistance to try these new technologies and really adopt that. We need, I think, a system to allow us to be effective.
Absolutely, and thank you for bringing that up. I mean, I'm not sure it's a generational divide, but I do think there is a wide spectrum of comfort level with technology, and that is for sure true. But I also think, and I don't remember which of the great faculty I interviewed said it, but you're not in it alone, right? That's the value of some of these communities of practice. Or look at what Luis and Christy did. I mean, they had a whole team. And so, not all of us can be a David Salzberg who can, manage 12 screens at once and 4 technology things. I mean, I know I can't. But I do think that starting simple and starting small and with support is a definite way of doing it. One way you might approach it, if you do have teaching assistants, graduate students, maybe this is the generational thing, are fairly facile with it, and offloading some of the technology to some of the graduate students' TAs. I've talked to many faculty who have done that very successfully.
It's a good thought. Thank you.
Thank you.
In the interest of time, Dr. Goldberg, thank you so much for your encouragement and this wonderful information you've shared with us. I'm sorry, my 4-year-old's jumping on the bed in the room next to me. So if you hear some yelling, she's fine. But for those of you who would like to continue learning, I'd like to encourage you to attend at 5:15. Drs. Robin Bachroth and Lindsay Corsell will be leading a faculty development workshop on a really important topic, curriculum development made simple. They'll be going through the Kearns model of curriculum development. So if you've not been exposed to that model before, I think that'd be a really important development session to attend if you can. And based on our last discussion that we just had, I just want to remind you that we do have some resources available to you on the FAME website in terms of technology, and we are in the process of creating some more. So thank you all for coming. And again, thank you, Dr. Goldberg, for a wonderful session.
Thanks, everybody.
Have a great night, guys.
Great to spend an hour with you. Thank you.